Pratik Chogli. It's February 2022. I'm here at the American University in Cairo, in New Cairo, Egypt. And I wish we could have gotten inside the campus. We're at the main gate right now, as you can see from the sign. The campus is actually closed right now, except for appointment because of COVID. But I wanted to do a video in any case about AUC, which is one of the case studies in my forthcoming book. And the focus of the book generally is about American universities in the Middle East and how they relate to American foreign policy. And I use AUC as being a case study specifically to look at how a prominent American university in the Middle East, how its geopolitical role and its role in U.S. Foreign policy has changed as the U.S. has developed strong bilateral relations with Egypt. So by way of background, the American University in Cairo is one of the oldest fixtures of American influence in the Middle East. It was founded early in the 20th century, right after World War I, by American missionaries. But American missionaries who had obviously a Christian agenda, but also an entrepreneurial business agenda as well. And one of the interesting things about AUC is right from the outset, it was founded in a very apolitical light. And the apolitical sort of nature of the university had to do with the fact that at the time, Egypt was under a British protectorate. And British authorities were very wary about an American university being started here because they were basically fearful that sort of universities generally were kind of seen as being incubators of political unrest, and the last thing British authorities wanted to do was encourage more universities, especially American liberal arts universities, that risk created more political foment. And just as a side note, I mean, one of the interesting things about British rule in Egypt, which is a whole another topic, but one of the interesting things is that the British, for all the investment they made in Egypt to modernize the place, higher education was an area they did very, very little on, again, in large part because of the fears of political unrest. But what ended up happening with AUC over time is that as the U.S. became the preeminent guarantor of Middle East security, and as the U.S. developed stronger and stronger bilateral ties in Egypt, AUC developed more of a political role, and part of that had to do with the fact that the U.S. government began to see AUC as an important part of American influence in the region, and so they began to give aid to the university. They just, more and more individuals who kind of rotated between government service and academia found themselves in leadership positions at AUC, and so forth. And so the relationship just developed over time. One of the sort of dilemmas that emerged over the course of this relationship, which I get into in great detail in the book, is that American policymakers, for a variety of reasons, made a decision that they were going to maintain sort of the crux and foundation of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship really would be with authoritarian governments generally, but military governments in particular in Egypt. And so part of the sort of implicit, sometimes explicit bargain in this relationship was that sort of Egyptian governments would fulfill their end of American priorities. For example, maintaining peace with Israel, keeping Islamist influences under control, and so forth. But in return, the U.S. would kind of tolerate to some degree, often even condone authoritarian governance in Egypt that otherwise would obviously not be ideal. And so this puts the university in a very difficult dilemma, because on the one hand, they're a liberal arts university and especially being an American university, it's the entire premise of an American university in large part has to do with liberal values, with defending freedom of speech, democracy, human rights, women's rights, etc. And these have kind of a sort of uneasy relationship with an authoritarian society like Egypt. On the one hand, operating, for one thing, first of all, I mean, the university knows that it can only operate with consent of the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government can shut the place down any time, and through varying periods of AUC's history, Egyptian governments, particularly under Nasser, did in fact move against the university and take control of it to varying degrees. So, one thing the university always has to do is make sure that they have the support of the Egyptian government. So this creates a dilemma in terms of its values, where on the one hand, operating sort of under an authoritarian government actually works to its favor, because if you look in areas like women's rights and so forth, AUC has always gotten strong support in that agenda from secular governments in Egypt, who are, for all their flaws, I think considerably more progressive than what a more democratic government in Egypt would probably tolerate, especially if like the Muslim Brotherhood were to come to power. At the same time, obviously, AUC tends to draw liberal American faculty, it tends to draw the more secular elites of Egypt, and so forth. And these are people often who tend to be on the liberal fringe of Egyptian politics. And so, naturally, there are limits on how much they and the university can tolerate when they speak out in defense of certain rights, democracy, and so forth, especially when it confronts Egyptian policies on censorship, human rights, etc. And these are dilemmas that have played out over the course of many periods in Egyptian history, most recently notably with the 2011 revolution and the counter-revolutions and the instability around that. I guess where I kind of conclude in terms of what is AUC's role in Egyptian, or in U.S. Egypt relations and in American foreign policy generally, I think the first point that has to be established is that it is a long-standing, historic, important part of U.S. Egypt relations, but ultimately one that's relatively minor. Which is to say the U.S. Egypt relationship, first and foremost, is grounded in security concerns. That is the preeminent concern. And you look at just the amount of aid coming to Egypt from the U.S., it's overwhelmingly in the realm of military, security, counterterrorism. And so insofar as the U.S. government and U.S. policymakers at all are interested in AUC, the amount of money, the amount of attention is relatively small. But at the same time, I think that AUC sort of both, it plays a dual role and often a contradictory role. On the one hand, it very much upholds and reaffirms the main tenets of U.S. Egypt relations. The university has found a formula and has made peace with both the American government and the Egyptian governments that are in power. Many of the Americans in particular, and also Egyptians who are involved with the university, are establishment figures, very comfortable with overall the broad outlines of the relationship. In fact, the recently outgoing president of the American University in Cairo is a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt, and in fact, AUC has often drawn former American diplomats among its leadership who again, have been very comfortable reinforcing American policy. And then on the Egyptian side, I mean, you see former foreign ministers and former high-level Egyptian officials who tend to, be on the board, be involved on the faculty, be involved. At the same time, AUC is a force for liberalism, liberal values. Often people at the university have, including administrators, have gone as far as to celebrate AUC's role not only as a force for liberalism, but as a revolutionary force, and you saw that during the revolution. My own kind of view is that AUC, I think broadly, it has a lot of goodwill in Egyptian society, and even though American foreign policy and so forth is very unpopular in Egypt, AUC specifically, and then American higher education generally, remains relatively popular. AUC is a place that Egyptian elites are very keen to send their kids to get into. It provides a pathway to all kinds of good opportunities and so forth. So I'm fairly confident that the university has found a formula and it will survive. But I think that role that it'll play in American foreign policy will continue to be relatively small, and it may be diminishing. I have a hard time seeing how, in the current American political system and with political trends, that there's going to be all that much of a momentum to give more money to the university. If anything, I think the amount of aid that the U.S. gives to Egypt probably is going to be on the decline, especially the non-military forms. And then I think too, as the world becomes more globalized, as Egyptians become more cosmopolitan, more sophisticated, many Egyptians who in an earlier generation would have been very, very eager to go to AUC, I think will just have more options. They may be able to come to American universities in the U.S. itself, but also even in the region. When you look at the Gulf countries and even American universities elsewhere in the world, there are a lot of ways to get a good American education, maybe even a better education than what is available here at AUC.